everyone. So in this video, I'm going to go over the PowerPoint on using sources and avoiding plagiarism in the week 3 module. Hopefully you've already gone through the lesson on research getting started. And in that lesson, in that PowerPoint, I touched on using your sources. You know, there's a lot about finding sources and whatnot, but certainly part of that PowerPoint mentioned different ways that you can use your source material in your essay. We looked briefly at, how you can summarize a source, paraphrase parts of a source, or take a direct quote from a source. Obviously, we know that we're going to be using information that we gather from our sources in our research paper. When you're doing that, you have to give credit to your sources, and you have to use that material responsibly. We're going to look much closer at how to cite the sources next week. Right now, I want to just give you a general overview of what plagiarism actually is, because it can come in different forms. Ways that you can help yourself avoid plagiarizing in your essay, as well as some other ways that we can end up abusing or misusing our source material. This is a very useful PowerPoint to go through because, like I said, there are different ways that plagiarism can occur, and there might be some forms of plagiarism that you could get in trouble for, and right now you might not be aware that those things are considered plagiarism. So we're going to go through all of those things so that you can make sure that you do not commit any of those errors when you go to start writing your research paper, right? So let me share the screen here. All right. So first things first, we all know that research papers require you to gather information from various sources and use source material in your essay. But don't make the mistake of thinking that your essay should be all or mostly source material. You are required to have a certain number of sources used in the essay, and using that source material is an important component of the essay. However, it is still your essay. The majority should be your ideas, your own original ideas and words. For this particular essay, a good guide would be to make sure that 80% of what's written is your ideas and your words. Only 20% or less should come from source material. If it's only 20%, why are we even using source material? What purpose does it serve? For this particular project, first and foremost, we're using sources and doing a research paper to give you practice at it so that you can learn the process and learn how to do it effectively. In general, though, we use sources to help support our own ideas about a topic, to help give credibility to our own ideas, the points that we are making throughout the essay. Those sources are there to simply back up what you are presenting in the essay. It also shows the reader that you have cared enough and taken the time to research this topic and to make sure that what you have to say about the topic is backed up by what others have said. That helps establish your own credibility, that, again, you're taking the time and respecting the topic and respecting the reader enough to do careful research, to make sure that what you are presenting in the essay isn't just your opinion, or that, you're not using information from random, unreliable sources, right? So it's building your own credibility as well. So keep that in mind. There is a specific reason why we're using the source material, but the essay is yours. It's not just source material, right? Now, developing credibility through source use can manifest in different ways, and we might not necessarily build up enough credibility if we are writing with poor use of sources. When that happens, when you're not using your sources very well, your paper might read like just source, 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 source. It's just a string of unconnected facts or unsupported opinions, or just, quote, 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 and you haven't done anything with it. It's going to seem like you are just copying and pasting information from all these other sources and just patchworking it together, and it's not gonna be you. You're not putting forth any of your own ideas in the paper. When you do that, you may also end up with sections that contradict each other, information that doesn't make sense together. If you're not careful using your source material, you might end up taking information and using it out of context, distorting it in some way. At its worst, poor source use involves straight up plagiarism. We're gonna be looking closely at what plagiarism actually is here in just a moment. But on the flip side of that, if you are using your sources well and properly, then you're going to have a strong paper that is centered on your ideas. Ideas that are advanced and explained through thoughtful engagement with your source material and proper citation of your source material. You are also, anytime you use source material in the essay, you're going to offer a logical analysis of that source material. You're going to explain what that source material means, connect it to the main point you're trying to make, connect it to your thesis statement. It's not just going to be, here are my ideas about this main point, quote. Moving on. No, you have to, why is that quote there? Right? So good source use is making sure that the source is being used with purpose, that it's helping to, emphasize or explain one of your own main points, and that you have, engaged with that source material and shown the reader what it means and why you used it in the first place. All of your sources will be treated with intellectual respect. Writing with strong use of sources is our goal, right? So, how can you use sources? We've mentioned this briefly. We're going to talk about it a little more here. The first way is through a summary. Remember, a summary is where you are capturing the author's main idea, right? Not the details, not the supporting examples, but the overall principal ideas of that piece, whether it's a website or a journal article or a documentary. If you're giving a summary, it's just a basic overview of the main ideas. It requires an in-text citation, right? The thing in parentheses that you see in papers. It's obviously going to be in your own words because you're taking a large amount of information and just whittling it down to explain the main ideas. It's going to be in your own words. It still requires a citation because that information that you have put in your own words still came from that source. So you still provide the citation. A paraphrase is where you take a smaller section from the source, maybe a paragraph, maybe just a few sentences from a paragraph, and you express the same idea in those few sentences, in that passage. You're going to express the same idea in your own words, with your own phrasing, totally unique to you. You will say the same thing in a totally new and different way. This is very important. We're going to actually, in week 5, we're going to look at a little 4-step process for how to do a good paraphrase. So we will talk more about that in depth. But just for right now, you need to remember that a paraphrase has to look and sound completely different than the original. It requires an in-text citation. Even though you're taking that little bit of information and putting it totally in your own words, still gets a citation. The third way that you can use source material is by quoting the source. This is where you are going to use the author's exact words. We typically want to use direct quotes sparingly, and that might be news to you. Many students are under the impression that when you're doing a research paper, that you should be including numerous direct quotes, that's sort of the best way to incorporate source material is through direct quotes, and it's actually not. You only want to use direct quotes if the author's words are perfect and cannot really be stated in a different way. Or if the author's words are talking about something that is very complex, and then it might just be best to direct quote that part, and then you explain that complex idea. But very rarely should you be using direct quotes. And again, direct quotes is taking something word for word from the source. It might be just a few words. If it's word for word from the original, it still gets the quotes. It might be a whole sentence. It gets the quotes. Might be 2 or 3 sentences. It gets the quotes. It might be the first 5 or 6 words of sentence 1, and then another 4 or 5 words from sentence 3. If it's exact, it gets the quotes. You would separate, like, you're not going to quote all 3 sentences. You just want to quote, you just want to use these words here and these words here. You would type out these words and then ... and then these words, right? Still quotes. If you are going to direct quote a longer passage, something that is 40 words or more, you would do what's called a block quote, where the whole thing is kind of blocked off and indented. I would suggest thinking very thoroughly about whether or not you even need to do a block quote, especially for the research paper in this class. But it would still be word for word. It has its own special formatting, which we'll kind of talk about in week 5. But it gets a citation every time. Even if you have said the author's name, it still gets a citation, even though the quotation marks are there to tell the reader that this came word for word from the source. The citation still has to be there. So basically what we've learned from this slide in particular is there are 3 ways that you can incorporate source material into your paper, but no matter which method you choose, you have to provide an in-text citation every time, no questions asked. That is super important, right? Okay. If you don't include the citations, this could be considered plagiarism. So, what is plagiarism? It is using someone else's words, someone else's ideas, someone else's images in a way that you're making them appear as if they're yours. It's using source material, whether it's published in print or online or in a multimedia fashion. It is using source material without acknowledging the source, without giving credit to the source. And it refers to a wide range of things. It could be submitting a paper that you didn't write yourself, whether a friend gave you a paper that they previously wrote, whether you copied a whole essay off the internet, or whether you paid a website, some random person through a website, to write the paper for you. Plagiarism. It is pasting large chunks of source information into your paper and trying to pass it off as your own ideas, your own words. It is using summaries, paraphrases, and quotations without citations. These next 2 in bold right here. It is using the exact words of a source, but not including the quotation marks. Even if you have attempted to cite the source, you have the citation in parentheses. If you have taken that information word for word, but didn't include the quotation marks, that's plagiarism. It's using the same phrasing and sentence structure as the original source, even if you've mostly put it in your own words, paraphrasing it. If it still looks and sounds similar to the original, just different words. Let's say, like, I'm not saying anybody would do this, but like if you just looked at that original passage and then took a thesaurus and said, okay, what's another word for this word? Okay. And then you write it down. What's another word for this word? Look at the thesaurus, write it down. So technically, every word would be different, but it's still pretty much the same. That's plagiarism. It's also when you mix up your source material and your own ideas, when you fail to distinguish between the 2. This means, like, let's say in a paragraph, you have your own ideas in the paragraph. You used source information in the paragraph, but you didn't put the citation in the right spot. Because the citation, we'll learn this next week, the citation has to come immediately after that source information. If you have a direct quote, citation comes right after it. If you have paraphrased a few sentences, citation comes right after it. If you have put that citation in the wrong place, then it's not clear what information in the paragraph came from you and what actually came from that source that you've cited. That's plagiarism. I think when I say that plagiarism is submitting a paper you didn't write yourself or copying and pasting information from a source, I think most students already know that that's plagiarism. They kind of get that. But I think it's the rest of these on this list that might be new information to you. But so that's what you need to remember most from this slide. Is those smaller ways that plagiarism can occur, especially these two in bold right here. Right? Why is plagiarism such a big deal anyway? It's dishonest. It is unethical. It's cheating. And whether it's intentional or on purpose, a plagiarized assignment can cause you to get a failing grade on that assignment with no chance to fix it or make it right. Could cause you to fail the whole class. It could go in your official record because we do keep track of these things in the communication system. It could even get you kicked out of school depending on the severity of it. It's also just not cool because you're researching topics and writing about topics that other people have written about. There's a dialogue that exists out there about these topics. And you're kind of short-circuiting that when you plagiarize. It's also giving you an unfair advantage over your classmates who did everything the right way. It's disrespectful to the authors of your sources. It's disrespectful to the instructor. It's disrespectful to your classmates. It's just not cool. You're also robbing yourself of the opportunity to learn new concepts and skills. Depending on where you see your education taking you, whether it's sometime in the near future or sometime down the road after you finish this program, you're likely going to need to do more research papers. So you're missing out on developing those skills and getting better at it. You are missing out on learning new information. And I'd like to think that the topics that are provided for you for this particular essay are all things that you would want to learn a little more about. So it does a disservice to yourself as well. But it's something that is typically taken very seriously in classrooms and in colleges. I am a big stickler for it. I run every formal assignment in every single one of my classes through a plagiarism checker. When you turn in your rough draft to me, I'm going to look at your references, your reference page, and I'm going to find every single source that you have listed on it. And even if something doesn't show up on my plagiarism checker, because it can only do so much, I am going to compare. Anytime I see source number 2 cited in your essay, I'm going to go to source number 2 and see if you used that information correctly, if you cited it correctly, all of that. I'm pretty thorough with it. So the more you understand about why plagiarism is taken so seriously, what all it entails, and then, as we're going to see, ways to avoid it, the better off you're going to be all around. Okay. So, yes, ways to avoid plagiarism. First, don't procrastinate. Do not wait until the last minute. That makes, the panic set in, the anxiety set in, and you are more likely to fall to temptation then just to get it done than if you had worked on it little by little along the way. So try not to procrastinate on the research paper. While you're working on the research paper, take those orderly, accurate notes that we talked about in the previous lesson on the getting started section. Like, if you are taking orderly, accurate notes about your source material, then you're more likely to get everything right when you actually write the essay. Document any borrowed material that you use. Make sure you've done it in your notes, and then make sure you do it in the essay. Even if you're not sure how to do it yet, even if you're still struggling with how to do a correct citation, try to do something to make it clear that that information came from a source. We can fix the citations, right? That's not difficult. It can be tedious and takes time, but it's not hard. We can fix the citations. I can't fix when I look at your draft. I can't fix that this information came from a source and you did nothing to show that it was from a source. That makes me think that you did it on purpose and are trying to get away with it. And I don't like to think that. But if you just do it, if you try and you get it wrong, then I'm going to be like, okay, at least they understood that they were supposed to give credit to this source. They didn't quite do it the right way, but, that's all right. We can work on that. Makes a big difference. Work carefully with your source material. Make sure you're understanding your source material, that you are explaining it correctly, using it correctly, and that you're not misstating it or taking it out of context or manipulating it to make it say something it really doesn't, right? Okay, so we're going to go through a few slides here with different scenarios on them, and we're going to talk about whether or not that scenario constitutes plagiarism. So our first scenario here, you write a paper on the legalization of marijuana for your first year seminar. You save that paper, make a couple changes to it, and then hand it in for your political science course the next semester. Could it be considered academically dishonest? It could be. There's a term for this that we'll see towards the end of the PowerPoint. It's called Falstaffing. No, this one's called double dipping. My bad. Double dipping. So you'd think that it should be no big deal to reuse something that you wrote yourself, right? However, it's often frowned upon. The idea is that when you're in college, you should do the work that's asked of you in each class and not reuse things. I'm not saying that I totally agree with that, but it is often the way things are handled. I would say if you ever run into this situation, ask. Just to make sure that you're covering your butt, and that if by some chance you have instructors that communicate with each other, that it's not found out after the fact that you reused a paper. But just so you know, it could be, you could get in trouble for it. All right, next scenario. Your professor discusses some interesting ideas in today's lecture on Plato. You decide to use your lecture notes in your paper. Could it be considered academically dishonest? The answer, probably not. But it could be if you do not cite the notes. So if you're in this class and you have to write a paper for this class, and the instructor for this class had something interesting and pertinent in their lecture, or in maybe a PowerPoint or something, then the first thing is just ask. Ask the instructor, let them know what you found useful and what you'd like to use in your assignment, in your essay, and just ask them, are you okay with that? Do you want me to cite it? Because there is a way to cite it and create a reference entry for it. Just see what they say. I don't think they're going to say, no, you can't use it at all. It's really just a matter of, do I need to cite it? Do I need to give you credit for this? See what they say. If by chance they are like, no, I'd really prefer that you not use anything from my lecture notes or PowerPoints, then ask, okay, well, can you point me in a direction that would, where I could get similar information, right? But there is a way to cite lecture notes and PowerPoints, just so you know. Next scenario. So, in a paper on the history of hate speech in America, you find this passage right here in the fall 2001 article in Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy by Jennifer E. Rothman. So, you're writing a paper about the history of hate speech in America. You read this article, and this section right here stood out to you, and you would like to quote it in your paper. So quoting it exactly word for word, right? We got quotation marks, so we're good there. We have a citation, so we're good there. So you decide to use this as is, this quote with the citation. Could it be considered academically dishonest? Could it be considered plagiarism? Not on the surface. You definitely aren't running the risk of being accused of plagiarism because you haven't cited the source or done it properly. You have the quotes, you have the citation. The only problem that could arise in this case, and something you need to think about when you are reading through your sources, there are some not so common words and phrases being used in this passage right here, like virtual anonymity, proliferation, dissemination. You need to make sure that you understand the vocabulary being used in anything that you are direct quoting, because you're not having to put it in your own words like you would with a summary or a paraphrase. You just have to copy and paste it and make sure the quotations are there and make sure the citation is there. But even though you don't have to put it in your own words if you're using a direct quote, you still should make sure that you could put it in your own words if necessary. You have to make sure that you fully understand the material that you are going to include in your essay, especially if it's a direct quote. But even if it's a summary or a paraphrase, you have to be correct. You have to be accurate. So when it's a direct quote, make sure that you fully understand the full direct quote. Don't just put it in there if you don't fully get it, because you might end up misrepresenting the quote, what the author originally meant. So you have to make sure you understand your sources before you just start incorporating them into the essay. Okay. So those were more about kind of academic dishonesty here. Now we're getting into perhaps some full-on plagiarism. We have this original passage over here under our scenario column. So this original passage, we are writing some sort of paper about tattoos, and for whatever reason, this passage right here is useful to the point we're trying to make. So we have decided to use this information in our paper. So you can see the original here, and then see how this information gets incorporated into the student's paper. Here's the thing. Look over here under the answer column about, is it plagiarism? So what the student's paper looks like, if the source's words are in italics, right? The words from this original passage are in italics, and our students' words are in bold. Look at this. Everything in italics came straight from the passage. The only thing that the student wrote were these 3 words. That is plagiarism. They have, even though these 3 words kind of show up, not at the beginning or end, or within the information, this is word for word from the source. There's no quotation marks. There's not even a citation. So all around, any way you look at it, this is plagiarism. 100%. Next scenario. So we have another passage here about tattoos. We've decided we want to use this information as well. You can see here how it shows up in the student's paper, how they incorporated that information. Is it plagiarism? Let's look over here at our answer column. So this right here is what the student's paper would look like if, again, the source's words are in italics and the student's words are in bold. So just a quick glance, without even really thinking about it too much, we can see that there's a lot more bold in this one than there was on the previous one, right? So we're heading in a better direction, but let's look here. Look at all of this that's still in italics. That's still far too much that comes directly from the original passage. It also follows the same order of ideas, right? So here's the original. Clearly, tattooing has emerged from the underbelly to the surface of the American landscape. And as the popularity of tattoos has expanded, so has the art itself. No longer restricted to Betty Page lookalikes, muddy blue anchors, and ribbon-wrapped hearts reading Mom, today's tattoo images make bold statements of personality as individualized and varied as any art form. Here's the student version. It's a fact that tattoos have arisen. That's basically, clearly tattooing has emerged. It's a fact that tattoos have arisen. From the underbelly to the top of the American landscape, tattooing has experienced a growing popularity, and so has the art itself. Popularity of tattoos has expanded, so has the art itself. It is no longer limited to sailor-style ships and blue anchors or biker-type hearts reading Mom. No longer restricted to Betty Page lookalikes, muddy blue anchors, and ribbon-wrapped hearts reading Mom. Today's images make bold statements of individualized personality as diverse as any art form. Today's tattoo images make bold statements of personality as individualized and varied as any art form. So even with the parts that, even if they had paraphrased all of it and nothing was in italics, it still follows the same exact order. It still sounds almost exactly like the original. So even though it has the citation, this is plagiarism. So please keep in mind that your source use has to be thoughtful, and it has to be accurate, and it has to be effective. Ugh. You can't have anything that too closely resembles the original source material. The only time it should closely resemble the source material is if you're using a direct quote. but we want to use those sparingly. You want the majority of your source material to be in the form of summaries and paraphrases, which means it has to be completely different from, totally original to you from the original. You're going to say the same thing in a completely new and different way. Again, we will look more at how to do that properly in week 5. There are some other ways, though, that we might end up abusing or misusing our source material. So there's a passage here that we're kind of using as our basis, but I don't think we really need to look too closely at it if you're watching the video. One way that we can misuse our source material is if we use it inaccurately. So again, this goes back to making sure you fully understand what the source is saying, but also not to make any typos, not to make any errors when you're taking a direct quote, or even if you're paraphrasing it. Make sure that you're being accurate. That's really more about not only fully understanding, but just being careful and taking your time. Using source material out of context. This is when you sort of twist what the source said to make it fit what you want it to say. The example down here, it says, according to Marcela Valdez, while Monroe's characters are interesting, Monroe's weakness as a fiction writer is that she shows little regard for chronology. Little quote there. This quote is right. It's been cited. It's all good there. But the problem is that in this article where this quote came from, it mentioned nothing. It never said anything about Monroe being a weak writer. That's not what it was talking about at all. It was actually extolling her, her traits, her skill. It never said she was weak. So we have used this quote out of context. We made it say something it didn't really say. Overusing source material. This is probably the most common other source abuse that I come across in student papers. It's where, look at this example right here. Everything that's in italics are direct quotes from the source, and everything that's in bold is what the student added. And they basically only added transitions to get us from one direct quote to the next. Everything has the quotation marks the way it should. It has a citation the way it should. This isn't plagiarism. It's just really poor use of sources because you've overused the source. There's nothing in here that's actually original to the student. We get no sense of what the student is actually trying to say about this point. Don't overuse your source material. Again, 80% your own original ideas and words. Plucking quotations. This is where, you have your own ideas. Like typically characters such as Del Jordan, Louisa Dowd, and Almeda Roth experience a crisis through contact with particular men, period. And then all of a sudden the quote starts. They fight against and seek refuge in the people they love. Citation, end. Nothing that comes after it. Plucking quotations is where you literally just like copied and pasted the quote and just dropped it into the paragraph. You didn't introduce the quote, you didn't integrate it into your own writing, and you didn't follow up on it, right? You always have to integrate and explain. Integrate and follow up. We are going to look more at how to integrate in week 5, but it's up to you to follow up on it, right? I can help you learn how to integrate the source material, but you have to take the time to provide the follow-up where you explain what that quote means, explain how it helps support that main idea you're discussing, how it connects to the main point, how it connects to your thesis. You have to provide that. Basically, what we're saying here is there should never be a paragraph that ends with source material, that ends with a citation, because you should always be following up on that source material with your own explanation of it. It should never be, a paragraph should never begin with source information, because you always need to build up to it, right? You got to get us to the point where it makes sense to provide that quote or that paraphrase and integrate it, right? Don't plunk. Blanket citations is when you have a paragraph, there's information in that paragraph that came from a source, and then at the very end of the paragraph is a citation. This is problematic because if the citation is right there at the end, that tells me what it should mean is that the very last part of that paragraph came from that source. But if the very last part of that paragraph came from that source, that means you haven't followed up on that source material. You haven't explained it and connected it. But what if it wasn't the last part of that paragraph that came from the source? What if the source information is actually up towards the middle of the paragraph? Well, the reader has no way of knowing. So it's either you're not letting the reader know exactly what information came from the source, or it was the end of the paragraph that came from the source and you didn't explain it to the reader. Relying heavily on one source. Maybe you have three or four sources listed on your reference page, like you're supposed to, and you cite, you have cited all of them. You've used information from all four of them in the essay, but one of those sources, I keep seeing a citation for that source over and over and over again, and not so many with the others. Maybe the other three sources only have one citation each. You're relying too heavily on just one source. You have to use your sources mostly equal amounts. You certainly don't want to rely too heavily on just one of them. And then failing to match in-text citations to reference entries. You used your source material and you provided a citation, but that citation doesn't match up to any of the sources listed on your reference page. Maybe the source is there on the reference page, but either the entry is not right or the citation is not right, and therefore they don't match up. Or maybe the source that goes with that citation, you forgot to put it on your reference page. We're going to look more at what I mean by things citations and reference entries matching up. But one thing you need to just keep in mind right now is that any source that is used in the essay, no matter how it's used, no matter if it's a summary, a paraphrase, a direct quote, doesn't matter, has to be cited in the essay, and it must appear on the references page. Any source that's listed on that references page must be used at least once in the body of the essay. Those are the rules. If you have a source on your reference page and you didn't actually use information from that source, there's no citation for it, it doesn't belong on the reference page at all. Get it off there. So everything has to match up. Again, we're going to talk more about that next week when we look at how to do reference entries. We've already talked a little bit about double dipping. That's reusing a paper that you wrote for another course. Falstaffing, it's kind of along the same lines as submitting an essay that you did not write yourself, but in this case, it's like using another student's, right? These are two things that happen more in, academic situations. All the other forms of plagiarism we've talked about doesn't have to be for a class where those things happen. It could be someone who's trying to publish something and just really doesn't understand exactly how to do it. All right, so that's about it for now. We're going to talk more about the research papers and citations next week. The reference entries and citations. But please keep all of this in mind. Use your sources respectfully and accurately. Take good notes and keep track of everything. And just remember that plagiarism comes in many forms. Take your time. Don't wait till the last minute. And just be mindful of your research process. Okay. All right. And if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, you are free to move on.